Thank you for joining us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. Without immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is beyond reach. That's the latest warning from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The good news is we have options in all sectors to at least halve emissions by 2030. The latest IPCC report laid bare the pathways we can take to have livable cities and sustainable future. We'll look at this and, of course, the first two reports released recently. Do stay with us. For the first time, the approval session between scientists and government officials on the findings went into overtime. Delays and disagreement on Sunday, the 3rd of April, pushed the release originally scheduled for early hours on Monday, the 4th of April, till much later in the day.
Solutions to climate change have implications for the economic activities of countries and regions all over the world. Many countries and regions understand this, and that's why they are keenly interested in ensuring that the summary for policymakers report very balanced and comprehensive and faithful to the underlying assessment. Unfortunately, I must say, some countries approach the approval process from a narrow perspective, and they tend to think just about their own economic interest, and some try to even derail the approval process by coming up with over and over and over again suggestions for amendments that cover, their peculiar economic interests. And that is part of the reason why we delayed. But also a lot of it was just simply that countries have taken deep interest in climate change, and they really want to ensure that the evidence that we're presenting is balanced and robust.
The third in the series of findings provides the most recent scientific knowledge on mitigation, but it also shows that between 2010 and 2019, the world saw average global greenhouse gas emissions at their highest levels in human history. It shows that even if all the policies to cut carbon that governments had put in place by the end of 2020 were fully implemented, the world will still warm by 3.2 degrees Celsius this century.
The report absolutely makes clear is that we're not talking about business as usual if we are going to address the challenge of climate change. So we don't look at the immediate past and say we expect that pattern to continue. The message is very clear. The governments of the world have set targets in the Paris Agreement or the Paris goals of limiting warming to 1.5 or maybe 2 degrees. And what we have done is set out very clearly, it's almost through the laws of physics and chemistry, that is what would need to happen if we were to limit warming to these levels. Now, we're very conscious of the question about this big change of direction, and it also has an assessment about the feasibility of actually the kind of system changes that would be needed. And just to say, the longer we put off action in terms of addressing climate change, the bigger the feasibility challenges will be. And that is a very, very clear message of the report.
The next few years are critical, says the IPCC. Reducing temperature increases to within 1.5 degrees Celsius requires global greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 2025 at the latest and be reduced by 43% by 2030. At the same time, methane will also need to be reduced by about a third. At this point, only severe emissions cut in this decade across all sectors, from agriculture and transport to energy and buildings, can turn things around, the report says. Even then, governments would also need to bolster efforts to plant more trees and develop technologies that could remove some of the carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere after more than a century of industrial activities.
We can have laws, we can have things written on pieces of paper, but do they actually make a difference on the ground? And does it make a difference to emissions? Now, in fact, the report that we've written does assess literature from quite a number of studies that have tried to address that question very directly. Some of the studies by looking backwards and trying to assess what kind of changes in emissions have occurred. And other studies which kind of look forward and try to predict the effects of policies and regulations that have come into place. So there are actually specific numbers in the report and specific numbers in the summary for policymakers, and some of the estimates lead to a guess that an estimate of about maybe 3.5% of current global emissions. Our emissions would have been 3% higher had these laws and policies not been put in place. And other estimates actually go much higher. They suggest that emissions would have been 10% higher than they currently are if we hadn't had these laws and policies. So, we can lament the fact we are beginning to slow the pace of growth of greenhouse gas emissions. It could have been higher if we had not taken action. And the challenge now is really to step up the pace of that action. We have the tools, we have the regulations, we have the policies. We need to make them tighter, and we need to spread them more widely in order to make changes.
Despite climate change warnings issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change since 1990, global emissions have continued to rise in the last decade, reaching their highest point in history. And the result is catastrophe already being experienced across the world. Reaction from the United Nations Secretary General was swift and fiery.
Cataloguing the empty pledges that put us firmly on track towards an unlivable world. We are on a fast track to climate disaster. Major cities underwater, unprecedented heat waves, terrifying storms, widespread water shortages, the extinction of 1 million species of plants and animals. And this is not fiction or exaggeration. It is what science tells us will result from our current energy policies. We are on a pathway to global warming of more than double the 1.5-degree limit agreed in Paris. Some government and business leaders are saying one thing but doing another. Simply put, they are lying. And the results will be catastrophic. This is a climate emergency. Climate scientists warn that we are already perilously close to tipping points that could lead to cascading and irreversible climate impacts. But high-emitting governments and corporations are not just turning a blind eye. They are adding fuel to the flames. They are choking our planet based on their vested interests and historic investments in fossil fuels, when cheaper, renewable solutions provide green jobs, energy security, and greater price stability. The main problem, the enormous growing emissions gap, was all but ignored. And the science is clear. To keep the 1.5-degree limit agreed in Paris within reach, we need to cut global emissions by 45% this decade. But current climate pledges would mean a 14% increase in emissions. And most major emitters are not taking the steps needed to fulfill even these inadequate promises. Climate activists are sometimes depicted as dangerous radicals. But the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing the production of fossil fuels. Investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. Such investments will soon be stranded assets, a blot on the landscape and a blight on investment portfolios. But it doesn't have to be this way. Today's report is focused on mitigation, cutting emissions. It sets out viable, financially sound options in every sector that can keep the possibility of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees alive.
To change the current course means spending more money on renewables and shun subsidies for fossil fuel, a move that will hurt countries like Nigeria badly.
The pathway for Nigeria is to start an urgent national conversation about how to move away from too much dependence on oil and gas to a green future. The good news is that Nigeria is also endowed with enormous renewable resources. And some policies are in place, but we really need to now scale up our implementation. Otherwise, we will find ourselves really lagging behind, and the consequences of not really planning our transition will be catastrophic. Because the truth is that although emissions have continued to rise over the past decade, there has also been massive investment in renewable resources around the world, and the transition is well underway. And so Nigeria really needs to get its act together in order to participate effectively in the green transition. Otherwise, it will be left behind.
The first of the installments of the IPCC's sixth assessment report, titled The Physical Science Basis, was released in September 2021. In it, the panel unequivocally attributed extreme weather events to climate change.
The report is very clear that with further warming in the coming years, we expect to see new extremes that are unprecedented in magnitude, frequency, timing, or in regions that have never encountered those types of extremes. And I think an important aspect that is shared by all the authors of this report, all the scientists, is that, for decision-making worldwide, many people just look backwards. What was the extreme event of the last 30 years, of the last 100 years? But in a changing climate, that is not sufficient. It's really important to take into account these new types of extremes, these intensified extremes that are going to happen in the coming years or decades. And let me finish by one example. With gradual sea level rise, the extreme sea level events that occurred in the past just once per century will occur more and more frequently in the future. For most coastal places worldwide, those that occurred only once per century in the past are expected to occur once to twice per 10 years by mid-century. And the information we provide in this report is extremely important to take this information into account and to prepare for these events.
The second was released on February 28th this year. It laid bare that inequality makes certain communities and countries more vulnerable to climate change impacts. In the second report, the IPCC for the first time authoritatively stated that climate justice now needs to be at the center of global policy making. The report, Climate Change 2022, Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, compiled by 270 authors from 67 countries, incorporated research from over 34,000 scientific papers, identified 127 risks to natural and human systems, and noted that nearly half the global population now lives in settings that are highly vulnerable to climate change.
These solutions open new opportunities for innovation in our societies and economies. Our collective and individual adaptation can be an effective strategy, but there are limits to how much we and other species can adapt. Beyond certain temperatures, adaptation is no longer possible for some species. Our report is a blueprint for our future on this planet. It recognizes the interdependence of climate, ecosystems, and biodiversity, and people. It integrates natural, ecological, social, and economic sciences more strongly than in earlier IPCC assessments. It provides new knowledge and information at regional levels and focuses on cities where the majority of people live and opportunities for adaptation and mitigation arise. Critically, this report highlights the importance of including and using diverse forms of knowledge, such as indigenous and local knowledge. But most importantly, it emphasizes the urgency of immediate and more ambitious action to address climate risks. Half measures are no longer an action.
Providing evidence base for the vulnerability of Global South, the report stated that observed average mortality from floods, drought and storms is 15 times higher for countries ranked as very high vulnerable, such as Mozambique, Somalia, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Haiti, compared to very low vulnerable ones, such as the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and Sweden in the last decade. More than 3.3 billion people live in countries classified as very highly or highly vulnerable, while 1.8 billion are in countries with low or very low vulnerability. Worse, the population in most vulnerable countries is projected to increase significantly by 2050 and 2100. The scientists say the evidence is clear and we all see it daily. The time for action, they say, is now, and this will require changes in energy production, industry, consumption, transport, and our attitude towards nature. The next few years are critical, say the researchers, because if emissions aren't curbed by 2030, it will make it very impossible to limit warming later this century. Key to that in the short term will be how we generate energy. Luckily, solar panel and wind turbines have never been cheaper, having fallen in cost by around 85% over the past decade. Experts say one of the most contentious aspects of the report concerns the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They say this can be done in a number of different ways, including through planting trees and making changes to farming practices.
We show that actually restoration of ecosystems and preserving some of the land in its original ecosystem status is very important. In fact, one of the most important options in our land, how we can reduce emissions. What we also show that any option that we want to implement will have negative impacts on some consumer groups or some stakeholders, some parts of businesses or of the society. And in order to manage these, the best option is to involve these stakeholders from the beginning of planning these actions. And we especially emphasize indigenous peoples that these are especially important to involve. Also, they can also have special wisdom to us in which we can benefit from when we plan these opportunities.
The conservation, sustainable management and restoration of ecosystems to help people adapt to the impact of climate change is gaining increasing attention as much approaches are accessible to the rural poor in developing countries and can be cost-effective. Ecosystem-based adaptation approaches include, for example, coastal habitat restoration, agroforestry, integrated water resource management, livelihood diversification, and sustainable forest management interventions that use nature to reduce vulnerability to climate change.
One of the basic areas in terms of ecosystem reference to agriculture is agroforestry, making sure that when you plant, you just don't go on monoculture. Monoculture system have destroy the forest because we want to plant. Monoculture brings, some insects will just spring up because they are used as a plant. But if you use a kind of different mixed cropping, one will not be vulnerable to the other one. The vulnerability of one insect will not accommodate in another plant. So if one plant is susceptible to one insect, it will not be susceptible to that one. So it will bring down the threshold of invasion of those insects. So the ecosystem is all encompassing, making sure that we make use of all these things that God has created to mitigate the effect of climate change. And that's why we use the word ecosystem-based adaptation. In Ebabosa, we use the ecosystem-based adaptation driven agriculture. One of our pillars, we call it amalgamation of the ecosystem-based driven agriculture and clean energy, using mitigation to power adaptation.
Secular, drought-resistant Tolu-Kerr gardens have sprung up in Senegal. It is a sustainability project hoping to mark a more local approach to what is known as Africa's Great Green Wall Initiative, which aims to slow desertification across the continent's Sahel region. These Senegalese farmers are planting the gardens known as Tolu-Kerr. The Great Green Wall project is an ambitious attempt to plant 5,000-mile belt of trees, including edible species like papayas and mangoes, as well as medicinal plants like moringa and sage, across the length of the Sahel from Senegal to Djibouti. Bokidjawe is a border town in northeastern Senegal.
So you see here, it's almost 100 papaya trees. Here you have the medicinal plants in the front row, and the next 3 rows are dedicated to the vegetables, a variety of vegetables, the papaya, the lemon trees, citrus trees, cashew trees, the native trees, fertility trees, at the back the baobab and the African mahogany, which are bigger. So in the end, we have an island just here.
The garden's purpose is multifold: restoration, slowing desertification, and improving food security and livelihoods of the people living in the Sahel.
We need to think of the Great Green Wall as big, but with actions that are permanent, useful, and consequential, and not just say we shall make the Great Wall greener. But you see, and it's possible. Imagine 1,000 Toluca, 2,000 Toluca interconnected. 1,000 Toluca equals 1.5 million trees. Do you realize? So if we start, we can make a lot.
When the COVID-19 crisis began, Senegal's borders were closed to many foreign imports and travelers, including Ali, who was visiting from Brazil, where he's based.
I've done a lot in Brazil, but I feel better being at home, and I think that this is probably making diaspora think as well. The building of our dear Africa, it has to be done by people who are here, but also by the diaspora, because we have a lot of knowledge outside the country. We have to come back and build. And COVID showed us, I wasn't scared. I thought, leave your company that you've had for 20 years, etc., etc. But what I'm doing here excites me. I feel more useful because over there, people can probably continue my work better than me. Here, we need it. We need us to say it. I'm ready for this. I don't care about the rest.
Ali says the key to the success of the Toluca Gardens has been a strong sense of local ownership. For residents such as Musa Kamara, who works at a local bakery at night, this project offers an opportunity to feed their families better.
The day people will realize the full potential of the Great Green Wall, they will stop these dangerous migration routes where you can lose your life at sea. I think it's much better to work the soil for 2 years. 2 years only. With what they will harvest here, they will never want to leave because they will have their fathers, their mothers, their wives, and their children with them. It's better to stay, work the soil, cultivate, and see what you can earn.
It was from the ensuing shortages in food imports during COVID-19 crisis, particularly acute in Senegal's remote desert regions, that Ali and the project's manager, Karim Fakouri, who leads eco-village development for Senegal's reforestation agency, drew inspiration for the Toluca.
projet n'est pas identitaire. Il ne reposera jamais.
This secular notion is strong. It's about permaculture because there is biodiversity, meaning that there are a number of species that are mixed. It allows you to reinforce the production without using chemicals. Therefore, it is the strength coming from the mix of species that allows the setup of permaculture.
Sans produits chimiques. Donc, c'est la force du mélange des espèces qui permet d'installer la permaculture.
It's not clear how successful the new project will be. At one Toluca, in the remote village of Walalde, the desert had already begun to reclaim the land. But most Toluca have flourished. In the 7 months since the project began, around 2 dozens of them have sprouted throughout Senegal. Ecosystem-based adaptation is a people-centric concept, but one that acknowledges that human resilience depends critically on the integrity of ecosystems. Yet ecosystem health alone does not guarantee human resilience, so ecosystem-based adaptation is best implemented as an integrated element of a broader adaptation strategy. The ability of people to adapt to climate change is linked to their access to basic human rights and to the health of the ecosystems they depend on for their livelihoods and well-being. We are told if adaptations policies and programs are to be effective, they must integrate efforts to sustain and restore ecosystem functions and promote human rights under changing climate conditions. That's our show for today. Thank you for being a part of it. Our inbox earthfile@channelstv.com is available for your comments and questions. For all of us here in Lagos, it's bye for now.